Hi, I'm Mo Ijlali, President of Mindful Leader and your host for the Mindfulness at Work Summit. Today, I'm here with Gayle Van Gils. Gayle is the author of Happier at Work, The Power of Love to Transform the Workplace, and the founder and CEO of Transform Your Culture. She's a certified instructor of Search Inside Yourself, a meditation author on Simple Habit, and a senior meditation teacher in the Shambhala Buddhist lineage. Welcome, Gayle.
Thank you, Mo. Great to be here.
Great to have you. And before we jump into our session, I'm curious if you could give our audience a little bit of your personal background and how you got involved in this work.
Oh, great question. Actually, this work combines what I've been doing on sort of the left and right brain of me for my whole life. So I've been practicing meditation since college. And that was way before it was so fashionable. And I studied with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche at Naropa Institute and basically continued from there. I also got an MBA and went in sort of the human dimension of business and was working in strategic planning, coaching, et cetera, and realized that really what people were asking for from me had to do with the skills I developed from mindfulness. And finally, I lived long enough that my two worlds came together and mindful leadership is actually a thing. So that's how I got here.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And for our session today, and isn't that beautiful how that works out, where those things come together? And for our session today, we're going to explore 3 ways to transform your workplace culture. And I'm curious if you could set the stage for us.
Well, basically, I'm trying to bring to the world the fact that each person as an individual has the capacity to lead change, no matter what their level. I mean, you're a leader of yourself, you're a leader of others by your example, but also leaders in organizations have tremendous power to transform through bringing awareness in various ways into their organization. So that's sort of the basis for these 3 takeaways that we talked about. The first of which has to be to do with aligning your personal values and your company employees' values with the work that you're doing. And when you have that alignment, it absolutely releases energy. So on a personal level, I'll give you a really personal example. I know that it takes tremendous amount of my time and energy to do things like social media, communications, my email list, all that stuff, which is really important, or nobody knows what you have to say to them. But it takes so much energy that I put it off, and it drains me from doing what I love to do, which is actually write the pieces and communicate with people and have the coaching sessions, et cetera. So I recently hired an assistant. And oh my God, it just totally released all my energy to be aligned with what I love to do. He's aligned with what he does best. And it's just unbelievable the level of output that's happening. So that's really changed the culture of my own personal business. On an aggregate level, I work with companies to do the Barrett Values, Cultural Values Assessment. What's interesting about that work is it looks at what are the values that are held by the individuals in your company. Okay, so you actually know that we have a great values for communication, honesty, integrity. That's like a high value that's held by the individuals individually in our company. Then you look at what is our current company culture. Maybe it doesn't reflect that. And then you look at their desired culture. All of this, the employees give this input. Well, you can have a fabulous strategic conversation around aligning and bringing out the gifts and values that your people already have to get to where you want to go. And it also reveals where you're wasting energy. So in a recent survey, we discovered that there was a tremendous value for supporting each other in the company. And they have been pouring a lot of support into a particular salesperson by creating extra, I don't know, like PowerPoints and things for him to bring because he wasn't being successful. And they realized that they were wasting their energy that this person wasn't actually aligned with their organization. And that's why it took so much extra work. And so that came out in this cultural survey. They let the person move on to a different position, and then suddenly their sales went up. So changing the culture has to do with developing awareness around these issues and then aligning with them, having the courage to make changes.
Interesting. And to recap a little bit, so one of these three ways to transform workplace cultures is the alignment of values. And when you talked about values, it's looking at the individual's values, looking at the actual values of the organization, and looking at the desired values. And you mentioned the Barrett values. Richard Barrett spoke at our last summit, and great person to check out. And so his system, for folks who might not be familiar with it, it's one of the kind of gold standards out there for this. And so a great tool for people to check out. And then you mentioned how there's this kind of connection of energy, and when people are in alignment or when they're out of alignment. And you gave an example of how you're working with someone who has more excitement and interest in some of the things that you don't. And then another example of an organization where there's a situation where the individual didn't have that value alignment, and that was really a drain on everyone. And so being able to identify that and make the proper decisions is very important.
Yeah, good listening skills, Mo.
And Gayle, just one thing that comes up for me, because I think there's situations that we've all been in where there's something that we might not want to do, but we might not be able to afford adding a team member. We might not be able to bring on an assistant. And I wonder if in those situations, being able to, how you would speak to that. So how do you sort of power through those things that you might not necessarily want to do or to handle?
I think that's a great question, because obviously you can't delegate everything away that you don't want to do. So in that sense, it's actually finding some kind of, maybe some kind of value in how is this benefiting others by me doing this? I mean, you have to find some value in what you're doing. So I think that connecting the work you're doing maybe with the outcome and who it's going to benefit, whether it's that your team members won't have to do this, or it will help the team project succeed, or that it will get your word out to someone that would not have heard this information they needed to hear. Whatever it might be, is to look at the outcome, see value in that, and just say, hey, it takes work to get things done. So I think that you can self-motivate, you can self-align by looking at outcomes if it isn't actually something that's in your desired skill set. Yeah.
Very good. So what would be another takeaway or another thing to consider as we're exploring this?
Well, I'll tell you another example, which is that in one of the companies that I worked with, and I worked in coaching an individual in this organization, she was having some trouble aligning with the work that she was doing. And she had a real passion for a pro bono project. And I encouraged her to bring this to the CEO and see if he was interested in supporting or working with her on this pro bono project, which was in alignment with their company's work, but would get them out into the community in a different way. And in fact, what happened was other people in the organization are now complaining about how much time the CEO is spending with this person, because he loved the idea of doing this community work. And by her being able to do this community work and make a connection at the highest level of the organization, it was like what you said. She didn't mind doing the other work that she wasn't as turned on by, because she was able to give and get benefit. So that was another example of alignment that really came out of having the courage to say what would energize you, and then being willing to do maybe what you don't love as much. Very
interesting. And I wonder, for some folks, when we think about what energizes us, if that could help identify the values that we really hold.
Absolutely. Like in my book, that's one of the first exercises, is to look at what I love, what energizes me, and what I could let go of. And you can't always let go of it, but it may actually let you know some things you're doing that are draining you that you could let go of.
Very good. Excellent. And so we've explored this idea of values and alignment and energized, and how they could energize us, and how we could find our values through looking at what energizes us. And you've given us a couple good examples of that. And if we were to explore sort of another way to transform workplace culture, what comes up?
Well, there's a lot of fear in the workplace. And in fact, it's it's really the reason that I wrote a book that has the word love in the title, like the power of love to transform the workplace, because I'm not looking at love in a touchy-feely way. I'm looking at the love as an opening. It's the opposite of fear, which is a closing. So basically, there are a lot of aspects of workplace culture that can have a huge impact. One is there's this ingrained fear of idleness. I think it comes from puritanical culture. And this busyness, this always keeping busy and somebody checking to see if you have a moment down, well, we must need to give this person another job or something. That needs to transform, because we now know from neuroscience and from personal experiences that unless we have space to let ideas settle, let fresh ideas bubble up, have a chance encounter with another person, just create some kind of silence for creativity to arise, that you end up just doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. And it creates that sense of burnout. So that kind of fear of idleness is something which I think needs to be addressed in the culture. And it is one of the reasons that at first, when mindfulness practice came to the Western culture, people thought it was a waste of time, because it was that sense of time should always be filled. And now I think there's an understanding and a respect for the fact that just taking a breath can change so much. And you don't have to be afraid to take maybe 2 or 3 of them in a row and not answer immediately and not jump into the next task immediately, but really kind of feel what needs to happen. So that's some sense for actually talking about feeling, for intuition to arise. And there's this fear that if we connect with our feelings, or even if we bring our feelings into the workplace, that something bad is going to happen, that we have to leave some of our feelings at the door and then come in and be this sort of robot who only relates to work. But actually, that again is a fear that's misplaced, because if you can't bring all of your emotional self to work, then you really can't relate to what's going on with other people, and you can't have that empathetic response and exchange with them.
And so you mentioned the fear of idleness and fear of emotions. And, you know, I would think that you could argue that it's impossible not to bring your feelings to work. And so it's like you're bringing them and then you're working hard to mask them or sort of numb them. And
exactly. And that's why it really backfires. Mm-hmm. So also there's a sense of fear that has to do with people in leadership being afraid to share what's going on with the whole company. Maybe it's a trying economic time. Maybe there's a change coming. Whatever it is, if you don't share it, people make up a story. And usually the story that's made up is worse than the reality. And it's really completely unfair to people to make them wonder, is my job on the line, or are we going to shut down, or I mean, whatever the things are that people gossip about. So it leads to gossip, it leads to negative storytelling and lots of fear individually. So transparency is a way to, greater transparency is a way to counter that fear. And that is something that many of my clients have worked with, is greater transparency, maybe on a financial level, or the leaders themselves being more emotionally transparent, which gives other people permission to do that. Basically being able to share the whole self and to open the situation, open the heart at work, really leads to a transformation that's extremely positive.
So this fear of transparency and overcoming that, and this sort of fear of being open, and that makes a lot of sense. I do think that it's harder than it sounds, and so I would just encourage folks, because I've had situations where I've attempted to do that without proper training or sort of setting the right stage, and it could make things worse if people don't go about it in a very thoughtful way. So,
well, you were right, because in one case it kind of backfired, because they became very transparent with their financials, but they didn't tell the whole story. So then people got worried because they saw, well, the moment that the financials came out, maybe they were low, and then they made up the stories. What does this mean for us? So you're right. You really need to train in this, and you can get training in it to do it properly. So that's a really good point. I think of another story I'd like to tell has to do with a particular client who worked for a mortgage company that really had management by fear. I mean, they just had totally strict rules. You had quotas you had to meet. You couldn't take breaks. I mean, basically even going to the bathroom was almost forbidden because they had to get these mortgages out on a real schedule, and they had tiny little margins, and they were measuring everything. And it was even lunchtime was like you had 30 minutes, but you had to bring your lunch because you couldn't go anywhere in 30 minutes. And the morale was horrendous. And Nancy, who was my client and a very courageous manager, decided, well, you know, I don't think they see everything that I'm doing, and I'm going to try an experiment. And so for her team, she had a particular team of about 40 people. She said, you know what, when you need a break, go take a break. And when you have lunch, go take however long it takes. You've got to get out of the building. You've got to get refreshed. And sometimes she even went to lunch with them. About, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks after she had started this, she got called in by management, and she thought, uh-oh. They found out what I was doing. And what they said was, what have you been doing? And she thought to say, why are you asking? And the answer was, your numbers are so improved. Your unit is doing better than anybody in the company. We want to know what you're doing. So by her having the courage to transform the culture of her unit, she affected the culture of the company through the results. So I think that's a great story. Is that, you know, you don't have to be the ultimate leader in order to really affect the culture.
A very good story. And I think for folks who might find that, you know, the idea of giving people a break and taking as much time as they need for lunch, for some of us, we take that for granted. But when you're in an environment where that's frowned upon or seen in a way that it might impact results and all, it takes a lot of courage to push against that and try something new.
Yeah, she did it.
Very good. And any more areas around fear and different types of fear in the workplace that you'd like to discuss, or shall we move on?
Well, I mean, I just would say that individually, getting back to the individual level, I think you need to really do sort of an inventory of what you're afraid of. Like, write it down. Like, most of us are afraid of any kind of change. Write it down when that's coming down for you. Journal about it. Just look at it, examine it, rather than pushing it aside. And when you're feeling fear, neuroscience tells us it literally shuts down our prefrontal cortex, because you're dealing with this fight or flight, which I'm sure other speakers may have spoken more deeply about, but we deal with this sort of reaction which shuts down our critical thinking. So being able to journal about it or write it down or acknowledge it and just pause and take a few deep breaths is really, really, really important, because then you can get back to home base and you can move through it. So pushing it away isn't going to help. You need to look at it and then move through it. So that's personal advice.
I like that, Gayle. And I've always had such a reaction when people say conquering fear or being fearless. I just always felt like that was a bit unfair, because I feel like what you're saying makes a lot more sense, to work through it, to accept it, to kind of understand what's happening and to note it and be aware of it, versus trying to conquer it or destroy it, because that just doesn't work.
Nope, it doesn't. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And so we've explored fear and examining how fear could show up in different ways and the individual and how they could work around with that. And I'm curious, what other ways might people consider transforming their workplace?
Well, pretty much everybody on this seminar probably has an interest in building a community of greater awareness, because if you're personally practicing to be a more aware individual, you're inspired to share it. So often people want to know, well, how do I bring this into my company, my organization? How do I transform a culture where I can't actually talk about meditation? I can't actually talk about mindfulness, maybe right at first. So basically, I think that if you can be a coach or a mentor to people through the way that you behave and through being able to listen mindfully to them and model this kind of behavior, that's a really good step towards building this kind of awareness of another way of being into your culture. Just taking the extra moments to listen in the way that you want to be listened to and responding thoughtfully, and then actually mentoring, coaching people in these skills if they're interested. That's one thing that we can do. Another thing that you can do, we talk a lot about having mindful meetings. And when you have a mindful meeting, you don't actually have to overtly say, well, let's start with a minute of meditation. You actually could just own it. Like you come into the room and you say, oh, wow, I've been so busy. I need a few moments to collect myself. Do you mind if we just sit here quietly and just give me a minute? I've got to land. I've got to arrive. So you kind of own it yourself, but you bring that idea of taking a few moments to gather one's mind and body to be present. And then having some kind of a check-in with people. So again, this sense of we bring our whole selves to wherever we go, but we usually are not acknowledging that. And someone can just say 2 words about how they feel, like harried and worried. Wow, okay. Now we know that Gayle's not, she's not 100% here. Maybe we want to ask her after the 2 minutes, like, can we help you in any way? And and I might say, yeah, I'm really worried because I've got a client who's, got a real big problem. I'm afraid, but being in this meeting, I might miss being able to deal with it. Maybe the team will say, hey, you know what? You don't have to be here. Tell us what you want. If there's anything you want us to know, tell us and just go take care of your issue. So being able to bring this kind of mindfulness and awareness in a very, very natural way, you can be changing the culture, which allows feelings, which allows acknowledging space, and allows a sense of settling in to happen. Those are 2 examples.
Very good examples. And these are examples of how you could really build this community of awareness within an organization. You started by saying first thing to do is really to embody it and show up in that way. And so people would be able to tell just the way that you're showing up and in their relation with you. You might be coaching them or working with them in different ways. And then the other thing that you explored was this idea of how, and I really like this. So instead of starting a meeting by saying, we're going to have a mindful minute, to just own that for yourself, especially when you're trying to introduce something and get it started, and saying, I would like a minute or a moment to settle and arrive, and really modeling that and taking ownership of that and sharing your own personal benefits of that. And then incorporating this light kind of check-in where people would get an opportunity to share feelings or other things that might be within them, and to create awareness of their own feelings, but then also kind of create this awareness of paying attention to one another's feelings in general.
Yeah, great. So another thing that can happen at sort of a higher level is sort of a culture of caring. So an example of this was at Cisco Systems some years ago when John Chambers was the CEO. He had a policy that within 48 hours of any employee or employee's relative falling ill or passing away, he personally wanted to be notified. Well, that's pretty amazing because that was a very big company. And so having this policy where people were checking, right? Because if you want to get him the information within 48 hours, you have to have your finger on the pulse of what's happening with your people. That in itself, again, was personal concern that he had, bubbled up into the whole organization of everyone being able to talk about what was happening with their health or their family's health, which of course affects us probably more than anything else in our day. And being able to have sympathy for someone else and offer extra help if they need it or whatever it is really, really was important in the culture of that company. And many of the people that I've worked with who've been successful at any level of leadership in their organization always keep a birthday list and send a personal card to each person on their birthday. So these kinds of sort of organizational caring have a huge impact on the way that people perform because they feel seen, they feel known, they feel important. And everybody wants to feel important. And unfortunately at work, often that gets lost. You know, you only hear from someone if you do something wrong. So I think these are very important examples at the highest level and at any level of acknowledging other people and building culture. Now, of course, you can actually create, and this has happened in some big companies, that it just starts the culture of having mindfulness sits available, such as at Aetna and other companies started with somebody who themselves started practicing meditation and just asked for a meeting room at lunchtime and put the word out that we're going to sit. Or so you could just start a book club and study any book that talks about workplace happiness, workplace culture. Of course, I recommend my book, or Search Inside Yourself, which is a great book, or many, many others that give examples of, you know, how to actually incorporate these awareness and mindfulness techniques in everything that you do. Every little action could be done with a little bit more space around it and a little bit more mindfulness and a little bit more care and interest and curiosity in the other person and their perspective. And that creates really a different culture, community of awareness in your organization. So you have a tremendous power to do this.
And I really appreciate both the example of how a leader in a very powerful position through a simple act could really infuse this sense of caring and the importance of the human beings that are within an organization. And on the other side, how anyone within an organization really has the power to spark something.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter what position you're in, you really have a lot of ability to help bring about this kind of change. Great. And Gayle, any final thoughts around these topics and around the session?
Well, I'm very passionate about workplace culture because for me, as a person who's been working with individuals and leading retreats on meditation for many years, I was touched by the amount of pain that people felt, let's say at the end of a retreat on a Sunday night, about, they come to me and say, I feel so good and so open now. I'm afraid I can't bring this open person to work. How do I close back down? And they might be in tears. Many, many people came to me in tears. And that's really what spurred me to take this interest in actually how could I possibly make a difference in the aspect of workplace culture, one individual, just me, like what could I possibly add to this conversation? I felt it was important to explore because I think there's tremendous pain in people who are developing mindfulness and awareness and how to synchronize that aspect of themselves with their work experience if they work in a culture that's not determined by them, if they're not just an entrepreneur. And so I really, hope that discussing this and exploring this will help people begin to see that they can make a difference, not to be so fatalistic about it. Your option is not only that you have to leave your job and start a company, but you could transform your company. So that's my hope.
That's wonderful, Gayle. I've heard similar stories from folks, and for me, it's always like, all right, so if you're gonna quit, you might as well try. Like, why not try and see what happens? There's not a lot to lose. And sometimes when one person is thinking one thing, many others are too. And so it's just the courage of kind of stepping into it and sparking it. Great, Gayle. So for folks who might want to learn more about you and your work, find out about the book, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, my website is transformyourculture.com. And if you forget that, I think you can get there also by gaylevangils.com. So if you visit my website, then I actually have some offers there for you, which you might enjoy. And we can connect if you write to me on the contact page. And I just hope that this was helpful to you. So thank you for this opportunity, Mo.
Thank you for being part of this, Gayle. And that brings our session to a close. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.